and he is seen as a savior by young Saudis and by me. Wow, reading those words today, it's just incredibly jarring, isn't it? But back in 2016, that was the very real, genuine perspective of Jamal Khashoggi. He was a prominent Saudi journalist, a true insider, and he was talking about a young prince who was skyrocketing up the ranks of the Saudi royal family. I mean, this quote perfectly captures that immense, almost infectious hope that originally surrounded Mohammed bin Salman. But as we know, the political climate in the kingdom ended up taking a very, very dark turn.
Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're taking a completely objective look at the staggering duality of Mohammed bin Salman, or as he's widely known, MBS. What we're going to do is unpack a really fascinating geopolitical paradox. We're looking at how one single man could simultaneously become the face of these sweeping, modernizing reforms while also acting as the architect of an intense, highly centralized consolidation of absolute power.
All right, let's dive into this. Here's our roadmap. First, we'll look at the two sides of MBS, then consolidating absolute power. After that, sweeping reforms and regional wars. Then we'll cover the digital and real crackdown, followed by the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, and finally, accountability and the aftermath.
Section 1. The two sides of MBS. To really get this story, you have to realize that MBS seemingly emerged out of nowhere. Historically, Saudi Arabia was run by elderly men. They ruled by consensus in this notoriously closed-off kingdom. But when his father, King Salman, took the throne in 2015, this young MBS was fast-tracked right into the line of succession. And he wasn't just a new face, right? He was pitching a completely new Saudi Arabia. The whole cornerstone of his early appeal was Vision 2030. See, for decades, Saudi Arabia relied entirely on oil. MBS knew that with falling oil prices and a lot of youth unemployment, they needed a massive pivot. So his plan? Open the country up to Western tech and entertainment, build a world-class tourist destination, and fund the whole thing by taking their state oil giant, Saudi Aramco, public. He took this massive, ambitious vision on a global tour, and honestly, the West was absolutely mesmerized. You had Silicon Valley titans, Wall Street bankers, Hollywood execs. They all saw this revolutionary modernizing spirit that they just hadn't encountered in a Saudi leader before.
Section 2. Consolidating absolute power.
Okay, so let's see how this builds, because while the West was totally focused on Vision 2030, MBS wasn't just sitting around planning for the economic future, he was actively and aggressively securing his own absolute authority right then and there, both at home and abroad. 2017 was a massive watershed year for this. In May, he successfully courted the Trump administration and hosted the president in Riyadh. Literally weeks later, in June, he launches this sudden, aggressive blockade against neighboring Qatar. And that same month, he makes his biggest internal move. He outs his chief rival, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Nayef, basically putting him under house arrest. Then, by November, he launches a massive purge of the Saudi elite. So in just a matter of months, the entire power structure of the kingdom was sitting squarely in the hands of one man.
$100 billion. Let that sink in for a second. That was the staggering scale of the arms deal signed during President Trump's visit to Riyadh. The Saudis threw this massive, grand welcome, completely playing to the U.S. administration's interests in countering Iran. And in return, this monumental financial agreement basically solidified unequivocal U.S. backing for MBS. It gave him the diplomatic cover he needed to act boldly and unapologetically in his region.
Section 3. Sweeping reforms and regional wars.
Now this perfectly illustrates the core paradox of Mohammed bin Salman. It's this stark, almost unbelievable contrast between his domestic social liberalization and his highly aggressive, uncompromising policies everywhere else. In one breath, we see these brisk, long-awaited modernizing reforms. He strips the religious police of their power to arrest people. He opens 350 movie theaters in a country where they'd been banned for literally decades. And, crucially, he finally lifts the ban on women driving. But then in the exact same breath, we see this profound political repression. Just as women get the right to drive, the very activists who campaign for that right are arrested, with reports of severe torture and solitary confinement. And at the exact same time, he's prosecuting an absolutely devastating war in Yemen that resulted in massive civilian casualties and starvation, all while maintaining that ruthless blockade of Qatar.
Section 4. The digital and real crackdown.
To maintain control over this rapidly changing, very young population, MBS couldn't just rely on traditional policing. Instead, he built this systematic architecture of silence. He managed dissent through a chillingly modern surveillance state, spearheaded by his close royal court advisor, Saud al-Qahtani.
And the sheer technological sophistication here is wild. Twitter used to be basically the Saudi Congress, a place for open expression. While Qahtani weaponized it, he deployed an army of flies, which was this massive swarm of Twitter bots used to intimidate and just drown out critics. He created a literal hashtag called Blacklist, actually encouraging citizens to report each other. Western intelligence even discovered alleged Saudi moles working inside Twitter to grab private user data. And for the really high-value targets, they used Pegasus spyware, Israeli technology that can literally turn a target's smartphone into a remote listening and viewing device.
And that brings us right back to Jamal Khashoggi. Just look at how dramatically his perspective shifted in a single year. He went from calling MBS a savior to writing this in the Washington Post in late 2017. Saudi Arabia wasn't always this repressive. Now it's unbearable. Khashoggi watched as moderate figures, economists, clerics, they were all just rounded up in these purges. He was banned from writing or appearing on TV in his own country, which forced him into this painful, self-imposed exile in Washington.
Khashoggi was especially disturbed by what was happening back home, most notably the Ritz-Carlton purge in November 2017. Literally overnight, 200 of the kingdom's richest businessmen and most powerful princes were detained inside a luxury hotel. Now, officially, this was pitched to the world as an anti-corruption drive, but to observers like Khashoggi, it looked like a terrifying consolidation of power. It was essentially a shakedown where detainees were coerced, and in some reported cases physically abused, to surrender their fortunes and their influence straight to the crown prince.
Section 5. The Murder of Jamal Khashoggi. These two narratives of reform and repression, they finally collided in an event that would completely shatter MBS's carefully crafted global image. And it centered entirely on Khashoggi's transition from an insider to an exiled independent voice. I mean, you have to ask yourself, how does a moderate critic, a guy who wasn't even calling for the overthrow of the regime, how does he just disappear inside a diplomatic consulate? Well, that is the grim reality of what went down on October 2nd, 2018 in Istanbul, Turkey. Khashoggi simply walked in to get some marriage paperwork, and he never walked out.
Let's just break down the incredibly tight, horrifying chronology of that day. At 1 p.m., Khashoggi enters the consulate. Over the course of that afternoon, according to audio recordings from Turkish intelligence, he was interrogated, murdered, and dismembered. Later that day, in what was a deeply flawed cover-up attempt, a body double wearing Khashoggi's clothes walked out the back door just to fool the security cameras. But Turkish police almost immediately noticed the double was wearing different shoes. And over the following days, the entire Saudi narrative just began to completely unravel.
15. This wasn't some spontaneous argument that got out of hand. A 15-man hit team flew into Istanbul on private jets specifically for this operation. This team included a forensics and autopsy expert, presumably to handle the dismemberment. It also included Maher Mutreb, the alleged ringleader on the ground, who just so happened to be a key member of MBS's own personal security detail.
As Turkish intelligence systematically leaked all these grisly details, we got to watch the Saudi cover story rapidly crumble in real time. First, they claimed he left the consulate alive. Okay, when that failed, they claimed he died accidentally in a rogue fistfight. And finally, they admitted the murder was premeditated, but they insisted it was a rogue operation carried out completely without the leadership's knowledge. It was this constantly shifting narrative that even President Trump ultimately called the worst cover-up I've ever seen.
Section 6. Accountability and the Aftermath.
The global fallout here was immediate, and it was massive. It left the international community wrestling with the lingering, vital question, who actually gave the ultimate order? And we immediately saw a stark conflict in the competing narratives. The Saudi government maintains it was a rogue operation by lower-level officials and that MBS had absolutely zero knowledge of it. But then you have Agnes Callamard, the UN human rights expert who actually listened to those chilling audio tapes. She concluded it was a state killing that required international jurisdiction. Furthermore, the CIA's assessment, which was based on scrubbing years of intercepts, including conversations where MBS stated he'd show Khashoggi a bullet if he didn't return, well, they concluded that MBS himself ordered the murder.
Now, in the face of all this intelligence, we have MBS's own defense. He stated, "It happened under my watch. I get all the responsibility, but I am not Google or a supercomputer to watch over 3 million employees." Basically, he accepts broad leadership responsibility, but flatly denies any direct involvement. He's claiming that in a massive bureaucracy, rogue elements can just act without authorization. But that's despite U.S. intelligence pointing directly to his daily text messages with Saud al-Qahtani, the architect of the crackdown, during the exact time of the murder.
Which leaves us with this final, really provocative thought to consider. Today, Mohammed bin Salman is still hosting massive concerts and sporting events, aggressively pushing forward his Vision 2030 to diversify the Saudi economy.
But as he reshapes his entire nation, we really have to ask, can sweeping modernization and economic freedom ever truly coexist with an architecture of absolute, uncompromising control? It's the defining paradox of his rule, and it's a tension the rest of the world is going to have to navigate for decades to come. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and I hope it provided a clear, structured view into the complex reality of Saudi Arabia's crown prince.